At around 1 in the morning on the quiet streets of North London, counter-terrorism units carried out a carefully coordinated operation. Officers moved quietly through residential neighborhoods before simultaneously forcing entry into 3 different homes. Inside, 4 men were taken into custody, handcuffed, and transported away long before most of the city had even woken up. By the time the sun rose over London, the public learned something deeply unsettling. Authorities believed that Iran had been operating a covert intelligence network inside the United Kingdom. According to investigators, the group had allegedly been involved in activities that raised serious national security concerns. However, the arrests in London were only a small part of a much larger and far more dangerous story unfolding across the globe. While British authorities were conducting those nighttime raids, events in the Middle East were escalating rapidly. The region was already moving toward a major confrontation, and the consequences were beginning to spread far beyond its borders. What is happening now is not simply another regional conflict. Analysts warn that it represents a major turning point that could reshape the global economy, disrupt the world's energy system, and influence which countries hold geopolitical influence for decades to come. To understand how the situation reached this point, it is necessary to look back at the events that triggered the crisis. On February 28, 2026, the United States and Israel launched a major joint military campaign targeting strategic locations across Iran. During the opening phase of the attacks, Iran's supreme leader Ali Khamenei was reportedly killed when a strike destroyed the compound where he was believed to be located. Several senior military commanders and high-ranking officials were also eliminated during the same wave of operations. In a matter of hours, the leadership structure of the Iranian government was severely disrupted. For a brief moment, the international community waited to see how Iran would respond to such a dramatic escalation. The response came quickly, and it was far broader than many analysts expected. Rather than focusing solely on Israel, Iran launched retaliatory strikes across multiple countries throughout the Middle East. Ballistic missiles and drones were reportedly directed toward targets in Bahrain, Kuwait, Qatar, United Arab Emirates, Saudi Arabia, Iraq, and Jordan. For the first time, every member of the Gulf Cooperation Council found itself under some form of Iranian attack within the same period. This development shocked many observers. Several of these countries were not active combatants in the confrontation and had been attempting to maintain or even rebuild diplomatic channels with Tehran. For example, Saudi Arabia had restored diplomatic relations with Iran only a few years earlier, following a period of regional tension. Yet despite those diplomatic efforts, missiles and drones still reached targets across the Gulf region. The attacks effectively transformed a localized conflict into a regional crisis, affecting nearly every major state surrounding the Persian Gulf. One of the most dramatic exchanges occurred when Qatar responded to incoming threats. Reports indicated that Qatari air defenses intercepted and shot down 2 Sukhoi Su-24 bombers linked to Iranian forces. However, Qatari leadership rejected that explanation, noting that missiles and drones had been landing dangerously close to civilian infrastructure, including airports and commercial districts. Beyond the military dimension, the economic implications of these developments quickly became clear. Countries, such as the United Arab Emirates, play a central role in the global financial system. Cities like Dubai and Abu Dhabi host massive sovereign wealth funds, multinational corporations, and critical trade networks that connect Europe, Asia, and Africa. When reports emerged that drones had been detected near Abu Dhabi International Airport, global markets reacted immediately. Investors began to worry that the entire Gulf region, long considered a relatively stable center for energy production, might now be exposed to direct military conflict. Financial markets responded with extreme volatility. Oil prices surged sharply as traders anticipated the possibility of disruptions to energy supply. At the same time, industries heavily dependent on stable fuel prices, such as aviation, shipping, and manufacturing, saw their stock values drop rapidly. Investors began calculating worst-case scenarios that had previously been viewed as unlikely or purely theoretical. Those fears intensified when Iran announced a move that analysts had long considered one of the most dangerous possible escalations: the closure of the Strait of Hormuz. This narrow waterway is one of the most critical choke points in the global energy system. Roughly 20% of the world's oil supply passes through it every single day, with tankers transporting nearly 20 million barrels of crude oil from producers in the Gulf to markets across Asia, Europe, and beyond. Major exporters, including Saudi Arabia, Iraq, Kuwait, the United Arab Emirates, and Iran itself, depend on this route to move energy resources to the global market. When Iran declared that the strait would be closed and warned that naval forces and potential sea mines would enforce the blockade, the reaction across global energy markets was immediate and dramatic. shipping companies began reconsidering routes for their tankers. Insurance costs for vessels operating anywhere near the Persian Gulf skyrocketed, making many journeys economically unfeasible. The International Energy Agency issued warnings about the potential consequences for global supply chains. Meanwhile, governments across Asia, many of which rely heavily on Gulf oil imports, began calculating emergency strategies in case the disruption continued. Stock markets around the world reacted sharply to the news. Energy companies experienced sudden gains as oil prices climbed, but industries dependent on affordable fuel faced steep losses. Airline stocks dropped, manufacturing companies warned about rising costs, and technology firms experienced declines as investors anticipated slower economic growth. In a world where energy supplies had become uncertain, from Tokyo to Frankfurt and New York City, markets struggled to assess how long the disruption might last and what it would mean for the global economy. At around 1 a.m. on the quiet streets of North London, counterterrorism units carried out a carefully coordinated operation. Officers moved quietly through residential neighborhoods before simultaneously forcing entry into 3 different homes. Inside, 4 men were taken into custody, handcuffed, and transported away long before most of the city had even woken up. By the time the sun rose over London, the public learned something deeply unsettling. Authorities believed that Iran had been operating a covert intelligence network inside the United Kingdom. According to investigators, the group had allegedly been involved in activities that raised serious national security concerns. However, the arrests in London were only a small part of a much larger and far more dangerous story unfolding across the globe. While British authorities were conducting those nighttime raids, events in the Middle East were escalating rapidly. The region was already moving toward a major confrontation, and the consequences were beginning to spread far beyond its borders. What is happening now is not simply another regional conflict. Analysts warn that it represents a major turning point that could reshape the global economy, disrupt the world's energy system, and influence which countries hold geopolitical influence for decades to come. To understand how the situation reached this point, it is necessary to look back at the events that triggered the crisis. On February 28, 2026, the United States and Israel launched a major joint military campaign targeting strategic locations across Iran. The operation, known as Operation Epic Fury, involved coordinated strikes on multiple Iranian cities, including Tehran, Isfahan, Qom, Karaj, and Kermanshah. These strikes targeted military infrastructure and leadership compounds in what quickly became one of the most significant military escalations in the region since the early 2000s. During the opening phase of the attacks, Iran's supreme leader Ali Khamenei was reportedly killed when a strike destroyed the compound where he was believed to be located. Several senior military commanders and high-ranking officials were also eliminated during the same wave of operations. In a matter of hours, the leadership structure of the Iranian government was severely disrupted. For a brief moment, the international community waited to see how Iran would respond to such a dramatic escalation. The response came quickly, and it was far broader than many analysts expected. Rather than focusing solely on Israel, Iran launched retaliatory strikes across multiple countries throughout the Middle East. Ballistic missiles and drones were reportedly directed toward targets in Bahrain, Kuwait, Qatar, United Arab Emirates, Saudi Arabia, Iraq, and Jordan. For the first time, every member of the Gulf Cooperation Council found itself under some form of Iranian attack within the same period. This development shocked many observers. Several of these countries were not active combatants in the confrontation and had been attempting to maintain or even rebuild diplomatic channels with Tehran. For example, Saudi Arabia had restored diplomatic relations with Iran only a few years earlier, following a period of regional tension. Yet, despite those diplomatic efforts, missiles and drones still reached targets across the Gulf region. The attacks effectively transformed a localized conflict into a regional crisis, affecting nearly every major state surrounding the Persian Gulf. One of the most dramatic exchanges occurred when Qatar responded to incoming threats. Reports indicated that Qatari air defenses intercepted and shot down 2 Sukhoi Su-24 bombers linked to Iranian forces. This marked the first time during the conflict that another nation successfully destroyed Iranian military aircraft in direct combat. Diplomatically, tensions also escalated rapidly. Qatar's prime minister reportedly held an urgent call with Iran's foreign minister, demanding an immediate halt to attacks affecting Qatari territory. Iranian officials responded by claiming the strikes were directed at American military assets rather than Qatar itself. However, Qatari leadership rejected that explanation, noting that missiles and drones had been landing dangerously close to civilian infrastructure, including airports and commercial districts. Beyond the military dimension, the economic implications of these developments quickly became clear. Countries such as the United Arab Emirates play a central role in the global financial system. Cities like Dubai and Abu Dhabi host massive sovereign wealth funds, multinational corporations, and critical trade networks that connect Europe, Asia, and Africa. When reports emerged that drones had been detected near Abu Dhabi International Airport, global markets reacted immediately. Investors began to worry that the entire Gulf region, long considered a relatively stable center for energy production, might now be exposed to direct military conflict. Financial markets responded with extreme volatility. Oil prices surged sharply as traders anticipated the possibility of disruptions to energy supply. At the same time, industries heavily dependent on stable fuel prices, such as aviation, shipping, and manufacturing, saw their stock values drop rapidly. Investors began calculating worst-case scenarios that had previously been viewed as unlikely or purely theoretical. Those fears intensified when Iran announced a move that analysts had long considered one of the most dangerous possible escalations: the closure of the Strait of Hormuz. This narrow waterway is one of the most critical choke points in the global energy system. Roughly 20% of the world's oil supply passes through it every single day, with tankers transporting nearly 20 million barrels of crude oil from producers in the Gulf to markets across Asia, Europe, and beyond. Major exporters, including Saudi Arabia, Iraq, Kuwait, the United Arab Emirates, and Iran itself, depend on this route to move energy resources to the global market. When Iran declared that the strait would be closed and warned that naval forces and potential sea mines would enforce the blockade, the reaction across global energy markets was immediate and dramatic. Shipping companies began reconsidering routes for their tankers. Insurance costs for vessels operating anywhere near the Persian Gulf skyrocketed, making many journeys economically unfeasible. The International Energy Agency issued warnings about the potential consequences for global supply chains. Meanwhile, governments across Asia, many of which rely heavily on Gulf oil imports, began calculating emergency strategies in case the disruption continued. Stock markets around the world reacted sharply to the news. Energy companies experienced sudden gains as oil prices climbed, but industries dependent on affordable fuel faced steep. What began as a series of military strikes had quickly evolved into a crisis affecting not only regional security, but also the stability of the global energy system. And as governments, markets, and military leaders tried to understand the full scope of the situation, it became increasingly clear that the consequences of these events would reach far beyond the Middle East. Earlier, we mentioned a key development that seemed distant from the battlefield but is deeply connected to the broader conflict. While tensions and attacks were escalating across the Gulf and the Strait of Hormuz was effectively disrupted, another important development was unfolding thousands of miles away. Events in London suggested that the consequences of the conflict were no longer confined to the Middle East. The situation had already begun to spill into Western countries, revealing how global the crisis had become. Before returning to the events in London, it is important to understand the scale of the military activity that had unfolded during the first week of the conflict. According to figures compiled by the Institute for National Security Studies, by the sixth day of fighting, Iran had launched hundreds of aerial weapons across the region. The data indicated that roughly 941 drones, 189 ballistic missiles, and 8 cruise missiles had been directed toward the United Arab Emirates alone. Officials from the UAE Ministry of Defense later confirmed that on March 5th, their air defense systems intercepted 6 ballistic missiles and 125 drones in just a single day. Despite those interceptions, falling debris still caused injuries in Abu Dhabi, where 6 foreign nationals from Pakistan and Nepal were reportedly hurt when fragments from destroyed projectiles landed in populated areas. Other parts of the region also experienced direct impacts. In Qatar, 2 ballistic missiles reportedly struck near Al Udeid Air Base, a facility that hosts thousands of American personnel. Following the incident, Qatar temporarily suspended air navigation across its airspace as a safety precaution. Meanwhile, Bahrain reported that its international airport had been affected by incoming projectiles, and the nearby United States Navy 5th Fleet headquarters in Jaffa was reportedly targeted several times. In Kuwait, both oil facilities and locations associated with American forces experienced strikes. During the confusion of these events, an unusual incident occurred involving a Kuwaiti F-A-18 Hornet pilot who mistakenly engaged and shot down 3 F-15 Eagle aircraft in what appeared to be a friendly fire situation. Although the aircraft were destroyed, all 6 crew members reportedly survived after ejecting safely. Military officials moved quickly to contain the details, but the event highlighted how chaotic and unpredictable the situation had become across a region already under extreme pressure. Beyond the Gulf, other countries also began reporting unexpected incidents linked to the expanding conflict. The armed forces of Jordan announced that they had intercepted 49 drones and ballistic missiles crossing their airspace. Meanwhile, Azerbaijan, which had attempted to remain neutral, reported that an Iranian drone had crashed into the terminal area of Nakhchivan Airport, while another unmanned aircraft landed near a school building. Azerbaijani officials responded with a strongly worded statement warning that they reserved the right to take appropriate measures in response. These developments demonstrated that the conflict was no longer limited to a single set of adversaries. Instead, it was gradually drawing in additional countries, many of which had no intention of becoming involved. Amid this expanding regional crisis, British counterterrorism officers continued investigating the addresses they had raided earlier that night in North London. The searches reportedly uncovered evidence suggesting that the suspects had been involved in surveillance activities connected to sensitive locations within the city. According to statements released by the Metropolitan Police Service, the individuals arrested in Barnet, Harrow, and Watford were suspected of acting as intelligence assets linked to Iranian foreign intelligence operations. Investigators said the group had allegedly been monitoring locations and individuals associated with London's Jewish community. Authorities emphasized that the case did not appear to be a spontaneous reaction to the current war. Instead, it was believed to be part of a much longer investigation. Officials suggested that the suspects may have been gathering information for months, possibly even years, documenting potential targets and building intelligence profiles within one of the world's most important global cities. Among those detained were 4 primary suspects, 1 Iranian national and 3 individuals holding dual British-Iranian citizenship, ranging in age from their early 20s to mid-50s. 6 additional men were arrested on suspicion of assisting the operation, bringing the total number of arrests to 10. When questioned about the investigation, British Foreign Secretary David Lammy stated that security agencies had disrupted multiple suspected Iranian activities in the country in recent years. He noted that authorities had taken decisive action because the situation required an immediate response. The coordinated raids carried out in the early hours of the morning were designed to prevent any potential escalation or harm. The broader implications of the case raised concerns among security experts across Europe and North America. Analysts noted that Iran was simultaneously engaged in a major military confrontation in the Middle East, while allegedly maintaining intelligence networks abroad. Intelligence professionals sometimes describe such networks as sleeper cells, groups that remain inactive for long periods before being activated when geopolitical tensions escalate. Security agencies in several European countries began reviewing their own threat assessments. Germany's Domestic Intelligence Service, the Federal Office for the Protection of the Constitution, warned that Jewish institutions, such as schools and synagogues, could face increased risk if the conflict continued to intensify. Officials from the German Federal Police Union also noted that international tensions could potentially lead to attempts to target Israeli or American facilities abroad. Adding another layer of complexity, some religious authorities in Iran reportedly issued statements calling for resistance following the death of Ali Khamenei. In Islamic legal tradition, such declarations can take the form of a fatwa, which represents a religious ruling issued by a recognized scholar. While the political implications of such declarations vary widely, they demonstrate how religious and geopolitical narratives can sometimes intersect during major conflicts. Taken together, these developments revealed that the crisis had evolved far beyond a simple military confrontation between a few nations. Military operations were unfolding across the Gulf, energy markets were experiencing severe disruption, and intelligence investigations were taking place inside Western capitals. The situation illustrated how modern conflicts can rapidly expand across multiple domains: military, economic, political, and informational, often reaching far beyond the original battlefield. Losses. Airline stocks dropped, manufacturing companies warned about rising costs, and technology firms experienced declines as investors anticipated slower economic growth in a world where energy supplies had become uncertain. From Tokyo to Frankfurt and New York City, markets struggled to assess how long the disruption might last and what it would mean for the global economy. Now here is the unanswered thread mentioned earlier. While intense fighting was unfolding in the Gulf and the Strait of Hormuz had effectively been shut down, another development of major importance was taking place thousands of miles away. It was quieter, far less visible on television screens, but it revealed that the effects of the conflict had already extended far beyond the Middle East. What happened during those same hours suggests that this confrontation is no longer confined to one region. Instead, its reach has already begun touching Western societies in ways that many people had not yet realized. We will return to that story shortly because it connects several pieces of the broader situation together. Before exploring that angle, it is important to understand the sheer scale of what Iran launched during the early days of the conflict. By the 6th day of hostilities, figures compiled by security analysts at Israel's Institute for National Security Studies indicated that Iran had deployed an enormous number of aerial weapons toward Gulf targets. According to their data, 941 drones, 189 ballistic missiles, and 8 cruise missiles were fired toward the United Arab Emirates alone. Even countries that maintain some of the world's most advanced air defense systems struggled to manage the volume of incoming threats. The United Arab Emirates Ministry of Defense confirmed that on March 5th alone, its air defense forces intercepted 6 ballistic missiles and approximately 125 drones during a single day of operations. Even with these interceptions, the consequences were not completely avoided. In Abu Dhabi, 6 foreign nationals from Pakistan and Nepal were injured when debris from intercepted projectiles fell in 2 separate locations within the city. It was a stark reminder that even successful defensive actions cannot fully eliminate risk when such large numbers of weapons are involved. Other Gulf states were also drawn into the escalating violence. Qatar's Al Udeid Air Base, which hosts thousands of American military personnel and serves as one of the most important U.S. facilities in the region, was reportedly struck by 2 ballistic missiles. Following the attack, Qatar made the dramatic decision to suspend all air navigation indefinitely, effectively closing its airspace as authorities assessed the evolving security environment. Bahrain also experienced direct impacts. Its international airport was struck, and several Iranian projectiles targeted the headquarters of the United States Navy's 5th Fleet, located in Jafar. In Kuwait, both oil facilities and sites connected to American military operations were reported to have come under attack. The rapid expansion of targets demonstrated how quickly a localized confrontation could spread across an entire region when multiple actors and strategic installations are involved. One of the most unusual and chaotic incidents occurred in Kuwaiti airspace during this period. Amid the confusion created by large numbers of incoming threats and multiple aircraft operating in defensive roles, a Kuwaiti F-A-18 pilot mistakenly shot down 3 American F-15 fighters in what appeared to be a tragic friendly fire incident. Although all 6 crew members from the aircraft survived, the episode illustrated just how difficult it becomes to maintain clear coordination during large-scale aerial engagements. The incident was quickly managed by military authorities, but it highlighted the confusion now surrounding a region that had already been under enormous tension before the conflict erupted. The ripple effects continued beyond the Gulf states themselves. Jordan's armed forces reported intercepting 49 drones and ballistic missiles that had entered its airspace. Azerbaijan, a country sharing a border with Iran and one that had tried carefully to remain neutral, also found itself unexpectedly drawn into the crisis. One Iranian drone reportedly crashed into the terminal area of Nakhchivan Airport, while another came down near a school building. The Azerbaijani government reacted sharply, issuing a strongly worded statement and reserving what it described as the right to respond with appropriate measures. These developments demonstrated that the confrontation was no longer confined to a single triangle involving the United States, Israel, and Iran. Instead, it was expanding outward, gradually pulling additional countries into its orbit. Many of these nations had no desire to participate in the conflict. Yet geography and circumstance were forcing them to deal with its consequences. The possibility of a wider regional cascade was becoming increasingly real, and there was no clear international plan in place to stop such a scenario if it continued to unfold. At the same time that missiles and drones were crossing Middle Eastern skies, another story was quietly developing in Europe. In North London, counterterrorism officers were conducting a series of coordinated operations that began in the early hours of the morning. Teams moved simultaneously on several addresses shortly after 1 a.m., searching properties in Barnet, Harrow, and Watford. While the Gulf region dominated global headlines, these police actions hinted at a different dimension of the conflict, one taking place far from the battlefield. British authorities later revealed what investigators believed they had uncovered. The 4 men arrested at the 3 locations were suspected of acting as intelligence assets connected to Iran's foreign intelligence network. According to investigators, the group had allegedly been conducting systematic surveillance of locations and individuals associated with London's Jewish community. Officials emphasized that the operation was not believed to be a sudden reaction to the ongoing crisis. Instead, the Metropolitan Police described it as part of a long-running investigation that had already been underway for some time. In other words, the individuals involved were not recent recruits or temporary participants. Authorities suspected they were embedded assets who had potentially been operating quietly for months, possibly even years. During that time, they were believed to have gathered information, monitored movements, and mapped potential targets within one of the world's most prominent cities. Among the 4 individuals arrested, one was reported to be an Iranian national, while the remaining 3 were described as dual British-Iranian citizens. Their ages ranged from 22 to 55 years old. During the same operation, 6 additional men were detained at one of the addresses on suspicion of assisting an offender. In total, 10 arrests were made as part of the coordinated raids. Senior British officials reacted strongly to the discovery. The country's deputy prime minister stated publicly that Iran is widely viewed as one of the world's most significant state sponsors of terrorism, and acknowledged that such activity had unfortunately appeared within British society as well. Intelligence services, he explained, had disrupted several suspected Iranian operations in recent years. However, investigators believed this particular network had progressed far enough that immediate action was required to prevent potential harm. The simultaneous raids across multiple locations during the night underscored how seriously authorities viewed the threat. Coordinated arrests are typically used only when investigators believe that waiting any longer could allow suspects to destroy evidence, escape, or carry out harmful actions. When placed alongside the events unfolding in the Middle East, the situation revealed a troubling pattern. Iran appeared to be engaged in a conventional military confrontation in the Gulf, while, at the same time, intelligence networks connected to the country were allegedly operating inside major Western capitals. Security analysts across the United States and Europe began warning that the most dangerous phase of the crisis might not have begun yet. One of the primary concerns involves what intelligence professionals refer to as sleeper cells. These are networks that remain inactive during normal times, maintaining a low profile and avoiding attention. They wait until a specific signal or instruction activates them for a particular operation. Because such groups can remain dormant for long periods, identifying them before they act can be extremely difficult. Authorities in Germany also issued warnings during this period. The country's Federal Office for the Protection of the Constitution stated that it must be assumed Jewish institutions, including schools, cultural centers, and synagogues, could potentially be considered targets for retaliatory measures if tensions escalated further. Germany's Federal Police Union echoed these concerns, explaining that it could not be ruled out that operatives might be sent internationally to carry out attacks against Israeli or American interests. At the same time, religious rhetoric began entering the geopolitical landscape. Following the reported death of Iran's Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei, a prominent religious authority issued a fatwa calling for what was described as a holy war. In Islamic tradition, a fatwa represents a religious ruling provided by a recognized scholar. For followers who acknowledge the authority of the scholar issuing it, such guidance can carry significant influence. The merging of religious declarations with geopolitical conflict created an atmosphere that security experts described as especially volatile. What had started as a regional military confrontation was increasingly taking on ideological dimensions as well. When ideology, military power, intelligence networks, and global politics all intersect at the same time, the potential consequences become far more complex and difficult to manage. In the United States, security agencies responded quickly to the changing environment. The Federal Bureau of Investigation raised its counterterrorism readiness level, placing intelligence and monitoring teams on heightened alert. The Department of Homeland Security issued security bulletins referencing Iran's long-standing history of targeting American officials and interests abroad, warning that the current situation could expand the range of potential targets. Former intelligence officials also began speaking publicly about the risks. Some compared Iran's strategic position to that of a cornered animal, arguing that when a state feels threatened, it may be more willing to take risks that it would normally avoid. Others warned that networks associated with Iranian proxies or affiliated groups could potentially attempt actions inside Western countries if they believed circumstances favored such moves. Another important detail highlighted by analysts involved the evolving methods used for overseas operations. Rather than relying heavily on Iranian nationals, intelligence assessments suggested that Tehran had increasingly turned to recruiting local criminals or individuals with no obvious connection to Iran. These individuals might be hired for specific tasks, surveillance, transportation, or delivery of materials, in exchange for payment. From an investigative standpoint, this strategy creates enormous challenges. Local recruits often have no prior links to foreign intelligence services, no digital communications connecting them to international networks, and no ideological affiliation that would immediately raise suspicion. As a result, identifying such operations becomes significantly more difficult for law enforcement agencies. While these security concerns were unfolding, the global economy was beginning to feel the consequences of the conflict in other ways as well. Much of the public discussion focused on military developments, missile strikes, air defenses, and strategic positions, yet the economic effects were spreading quietly through multiple sectors at the same time. The temporary closure of the Strait of Hormuz, one of the world's most important energy shipping routes, immediately affected global energy markets. Oil shipments traveling through the narrow waterway represent a large portion of the planet's daily supply. Any disruption to that flow rapidly influences prices and transportation costs around the world. As a result, aviation fuel costs began rising, shipping rates increased, and manufacturers started calculating higher expenses for raw materials and logistics. In Europe and Asia, consumer prices for certain goods began to climb even before many people fully connected those increases to events in the Gulf. The Gulf states themselves faced an additional challenge. Over the past decade, several countries in the region had worked aggressively to diversify their economies beyond oil. Cities like Dubai, Abu Dhabi, and Doha invested heavily in tourism, finance, technology, and global business infrastructure. The goal was to transform these cities into major international hubs. However, the arrival of ballistic missiles near airports and key infrastructure suddenly changed the investment landscape. Companies considering new headquarters or long-term projects must now evaluate security risks alongside economic opportunities. Billions of dollars in potential investment decisions could shift depending on how stable the region appears in the coming months. For many developing nations across Asia and Africa, the consequences may be even more severe. Numerous economies depend heavily on energy imports from the Gulf, as well as remittances sent home by workers employed in Gulf countries. Rising energy costs, combined with disruptions to employment and investment, could trigger inflation, currency instability, and political pressures in already fragile states. Meanwhile, inside Iran itself, a separate political drama was unfolding. The death of Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei initiated a succession process that carries enormous geopolitical significance. Reports suggested that his son, Mojtaba Khamenei, had emerged as a leading candidate to assume the powerful position. Yet Iran's system for selecting a supreme leader had never been tested under wartime conditions, especially with foreign military strikes occurring nearby. Members of Iran's clerical establishment began issuing increasingly firm statements about the country's position. Some representatives warned that if negotiations failed, further conflict could follow, and insisted that Iran still spoke from a position of strength. Others declared that any additional escalation by foreign forces would bring serious consequences for American troops and assets in the region. These statements indicated that Iranian leaders were preparing their population for a prolonged confrontation, rather than signaling an immediate willingness to compromise. At the same time, Western governments were adjusting their own policies as the situation evolved. The United Kingdom initially declined to participate directly in American and Israeli military strikes, but later allowed American forces to use British bases for defensive operations. Britain also began organizing evacuation flights for its citizens stranded across the Middle East. France moved its aircraft carrier toward the Mediterranean, while Portugal opened the Lajes field base to American forces. On March 5th, France also authorized the use of its military bases for U.S. operations connected to regional defense. Not every European country agreed on the approach. Spain reportedly declined requests to use its bases for offensive operations. That decision quickly generated political tension after threats of economic retaliation were raised by the United States. These disagreements highlighted an important reality about the Atlantic Alliance. While NATO members often present a unified public position, differences in national strategy and risk tolerance remain beneath the surface. Some governments prioritize direct military support, while others focus on defensive roles or diplomatic channels. For Iran and its allies, such divisions could represent a strategic advantage. Any hesitation or disagreement among Western powers complicates coordinated responses and creates opportunities for political maneuvering. Taken together, all of these developments show that the conflict is unfolding across several dimensions simultaneously: military, intelligence, economic, political, and ideological. The missiles and drones visible on television are only one part of the story. Behind them lies a far broader struggle shaping global security and stability in ways that may continue long after the immediate fighting subsides. So, where does all of this leave the world right now? What connects the quiet arrests carried out in the streets of North London with the drone attacks over Abu Dhabi and the sudden disruption of tanker traffic in the Strait of Hormuz? At first glance, these events seem like separate stories happening in different regions. But when they are viewed together, a much larger pattern begins to emerge. The real connection is that this situation has moved far beyond the boundaries of a traditional regional conflict. In reality, it likely never was a purely local crisis. What initially appeared to be a focused military operation involving the United States and Israel targeting Iran's military and nuclear capabilities has gradually expanded into something far broader. The consequences of the confrontation are now being felt across multiple continents. Energy markets are shifting, economic confidence in the Gulf region is being tested, intelligence operations are surfacing inside Western democracies, and governments around the world are being forced to reconsider their security strategies. One of the most striking aspects of the situation is how many different countries are now indirectly connected to the crisis. Some are geographically close to the Middle East and are affected through military activity or energy routes. Others are thousands of miles away, but are still experiencing security concerns, political tension, or economic disruption. Nations from the Eastern Mediterranean to Central Asia and North America are suddenly part of the conversation about what happens next. At the center of the issue is the Strait of Hormuz, a narrow but critically important waterway through which a large share of the world's oil shipments travel each day. When that passage becomes unstable or partially closed, the ripple effects spread quickly through global supply chains. Oil prices respond immediately, transportation costs rise, and businesses that depend on stable energy supplies must adjust their calculations almost overnight. This is why events occurring in the Persian Gulf can rapidly influence economic conditions in places far removed from the conflict itself. Meanwhile, developments like the arrests in London illustrate another dimension of modern geopolitical conflict. Military confrontations no longer exist solely on battlefields. Intelligence gathering, covert networks, cyber activity, and influence operations are now deeply intertwined with conventional warfare. Governments increasingly prepare for scenarios in which tensions abroad could create security concerns inside their own borders. The arrests carried out by British authorities were therefore significant not only because of the individuals involved, but because they suggested that intelligence services were already operating across international boundaries long before the recent escalation. Investigators believe such networks often function quietly for extended periods, collecting information and building contacts while remaining largely invisible. Only when tensions increase do these hidden structures begin to surface through police operations or intelligence investigations. Taken together with the missile and drone attacks seen in the Gulf region, these developments highlight how interconnected modern conflicts have become. A single military campaign can trigger diplomatic shifts, economic shocks, security alerts, and intelligence activity across multiple regions simultaneously. The battlefield is no longer confined to physical territory. It extends into financial systems, political alliances, and the global information environment. This is why analysts say the coming weeks may be particularly important. The decisions made by political and military leaders during this period could determine whether the conflict stabilizes or continues to expand. In international crises, there is often a moment when escalation slows and diplomatic channels begin to take priority. But there are also situations where each action leads to another response, gradually pulling more actors into the situation. Some leaders have already tried to estimate how long the confrontation might continue. Statements from senior officials suggest that the conflict could last weeks rather than days, especially if both sides believe they still have strategic leverage. At the same time, military strategists emphasize that the range of possible outcomes remains very wide. One scenario involves Iran adopting a defensive posture, focusing on protecting key infrastructure and absorbing external pressure while waiting for international diplomacy to create an off-ramp. In that case, the intensity of the conflict might gradually decrease as negotiations or ceasefire arrangements begin to take shape. Another possibility involves a more aggressive strategy, designed to raise the cost of the conflict for opposing powers. In such a scenario, economic disruption, cyber operations, intelligence activity, and regional pressure could all become tools used to influence political decisions abroad. Modern conflicts often involve these types of indirect strategies, especially when direct military confrontation carries extremely high risks. The situation around the Strait of Hormuz illustrates how powerful such pressure points can be. Because so much global energy trade passes through that narrow corridor, even temporary disruptions can have outsized consequences for markets and governments around the world. Energy security has long been one of the central concerns of global economic stability, and events in this region highlight just how sensitive that system remains. The same principle applies to intelligence operations. Networks operating quietly within foreign countries can create uncertainty and force governments to allocate resources to domestic security concerns. Even when no attacks occur, the possibility alone can influence political debates and policy decisions. This is why the events unfolding across multiple continents are increasingly viewed as different pieces of the same strategic puzzle. The drone strikes in the Gulf, the naval tensions around shipping lanes, and the intelligence investigations in Europe are all symptoms of a broader geopolitical confrontation. Each element influences the others, shaping the choices available to leaders on all sides. Another factor adding complexity to the situation is the internal political transition underway in Iran following the death of its longtime supreme leader. Leadership changes during periods of conflict can introduce uncertainty because new decision makers must balance internal power dynamics with external pressures. The process of choosing a successor has major implications, not only for Iran's domestic politics, but also for its future foreign policy. At the same time, Western alliances are navigating their own debates about how far they should become involved. Some countries are providing logistical or defensive support, while others are emphasizing diplomatic solutions. Differences in approach do not necessarily mean the alliance is fractured, but they do show that each government must weigh its own national interests, security concerns, and political realities. All of these factors combine to create a moment of global uncertainty. The international system is highly interconnected, meaning that regional crises can quickly transform into worldwide challenges. Economic networks, energy supplies, political alliances, and information systems link countries together more tightly than at any point in history. Because of that interconnectedness, the choices made in the near future will carry long-term consequences. Diplomatic decisions, military strategies, and economic responses will all shape how the crisis evolves. In some cases, the goal of policymakers is not simply to win a confrontation, but to prevent it from expanding into something far more damaging. What makes the current situation especially concerning for many observers is the lack of a clearly defined exit path. In past conflicts, there were often established diplomatic frameworks or international conferences ready to facilitate negotiations. Today, the geopolitical landscape is more fragmented, and major powers sometimes struggle to coordinate responses. That uncertainty is perhaps the most important takeaway from the events of recent weeks. The world witnessed a sudden shift when tensions escalated at the end of February 2026. The effects were immediate, spreading through energy markets, security agencies, and political systems across the globe. Where the situation moves next will depend largely on whether the leaders involved can identify a path that reduces escalation while protecting their strategic interests. Conflicts often reach turning points where careful decision-making can either stabilize the situation or allow it to spiral further. At the moment, the direction of that turning point remains unclear. Governments are preparing for multiple possibilities at once, from continued confrontation to eventual diplomatic engagement. For citizens watching these developments unfold, the complexity of the situation can make it difficult to understand where the crisis is heading. What is clear, however, is that the events beginning on February 28, 2026, marked a significant moment in global politics. They demonstrated how quickly a regional military operation can evolve into a broader international challenge affecting economies, security systems, and political alliances. The next chapter of the story will depend on how the key decision-makers interpret the risks and opportunities before them. Whether the crisis stabilizes or intensifies will shape not only the future of the Middle East, but also the global systems connected to it. And for now, the most concerning reality is that no one outside the inner circles of power can say with certainty which direction those decisions will ultimately take.